for joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Family Album on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are also providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Gabriela Alemán was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She received a PhD at Tulane University and holds a master's degree in Latin American literature from Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar. She currently resides in Quito, Ecuador. Her literary honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2006, member of Bogota 39, a 2007 selection of the most important up-and-coming writers in Latin America in the post-boom generation, one of 5 finalists for the 2015 Premio Hispanoamericano de Cuento Gabriel García Márquez, Colombia, for her short story collection La Muerte Silva un Blues, and winner of several prizes for critical essays on literature and film. Her novel Poso Wells was published in English translation by City Lights in 2018. Gabriela will be joined by Dick Cluster, who has translated 4 books for City Lights, including In the Cold of Malecon and Other Stories by Antonio Jose Ponte, Frigid Tales by Pedro de Jesus, A Corner of the World by Maylene Fernandez Sentado, and Poso Wells by Gabriela Alemán. His own novels include Return to Sender, Repulse Monkey, and Obligations of the Bone. Cluster lives in Oakland, California. So please welcome Gabriela Alemán and Dick Cluster to PNP Live.
Hello, thank you just for the introduction and for all those hard words in Spanish. Hi, Dick.
Hi.
We're going to start off with me reading a little bit of one of the stories that is set in the Galapagos. There are 8 short stories in Family Album, and they touch in one way or another different small anecdote stories that have taken place in the 20th century Ecuador. So I'm going to read Summer Vacation. Here's how my profession works. You come upon a sea of documents, speculations, and glittering trinkets. You toss in a hook. If fortune bites, you pull up something better than a sand dollar or a glass bead. Sometimes you land a 200-pound marlin. Other times your line is carried off, lost at sea, along with your hours of battle. The Baroness was a big slippery fish. The first time I told her story, what I did was craft a fake catch to hold up for the snapshot. That story was not the one I wanted to tell, but the one they wanted me to write. Sometimes that's how it is. You barely break even. You get by, but there's no satisfaction in it. What I did was distract the reader's attention with details about a racy film shoot with the Baroness as one of the stars. That's how I switched the live perch for the plastic trophy. I never forgave myself, not because I didn't do the Baroness justice. As a character, she didn't appeal that much to me, but because I never got to tell the other story, the one that truly interested me, the story of why the Ecuadorian government gave a blank check to a woman who claimed to be many things and promised so many more, which was also a story about the sensationalism of the European press, avid for scandals that could paper over the economic hardships of the Great Depression, as well as a story of the buildup to the Second World War. Chinese boxes, Russian dolls, stories within stories, whatever you want to call them. That was the kind of article I didn't write. What I did write, with a lurid focus on the details, concentrated on the legend that involved the 8 inhabitants of Floriana Island in the Galapagos archipelago between 1930 and 1934. Everything I said was based on speculation. The few documents that existed were articles from the time or interviews with people who had access to grind. There was no photographic evidence. All that could be said for certain was that the island's inhabitants were a strange group. Their story began in 1930 when a German couple, Dora and Friedrich Reiter, settled on Floriana. Dr. Friedrich Reiter was a dentist and a vegetarian, a proponent of nudism and Nietzschean philosophy, who, before coming to the archipelago, had extracted his own teeth in favor of steel dentures. He wrote pseudo-scientific articles published with a certain regularity in a small number of magazines, in which he offered a kind of self-help for fanatics. The way to save the world, the good doctor said, was through an ascetic life beset with problems. That was what separated the great men from the rabble. He had come to the Galapagos to put his theories into practice. Once there, he reported on his experience. Dora, 20 years his junior, rarely appeared in his chronicles. He never mentioned, for instance, how he forced her to give up her teeth and share his dentures. Nor did he say that in the volcanic islands where they chose to live, vegetables grew very poorly. During the dry season, there was barely enough water to drink, let alone irrigate crops. His vegetarian diet consisted of wild pigs and goats, remnants of the era when pirates used the Enchanted Isle as a hideout. All of this changed, I explained, with the arrival of another German couple, the Widmers, in 1932. Farmers from Bavaria, they came in search of a climate that would be propitious for the health of Heinz Widmer's asthmatic teenage son. Margaret, Heinz's second wife, was pregnant when they landed on Floriana. I recounted how the Ritters completely ignored them, walling off their farm and having nothing to do with the newcomers. Not an easy feat in an island measuring 67 square miles, though they certainly tried. The Widmers built their house near the only source of fresh water in the uplands of Floriana, just a couple of miles from the first couple. They had no intention of disturbing the Ritters, but they were practical. They thought it would be a good idea to have a doctor nearby, even if the doctor was a dentist, in case of complications during the birth. Relations were not cordial, but there were no confrontations. Towards the middle of that year, any possibility of cordiality went out the window. The third group to disembark on the island was the Baroness Wagner and her 3 lovers, Valdivieso, Lawrence, and Philipson. The Baroness had an immediate falling out with the other inhabitants. The break stemmed principally from her baths. She soaked herself in the fresh water spring on the hill, contaminating everyone's source in the process. But water was not the only problem to arise between her and the small society of Floriana. The Baroness decided to build her house alongside the island's only wharf, facing the Corona del Diablo, thus making it her private property. She charged the other inhabitants a tax when the boat carrying their provisions arrived. After a struggle, they had to give in. The rest of the coast was a chaos of rocks and reefs where it was impossible to land passengers or cargo. Then came complaints about noise, music, guests, and orgies. These were rumors, converted into evidence against the Baroness by the magic of paper and ink. While researching my article, I found a letter from Ritter addressed to the territorial commander in which he denounced Baroness Wagner. This woman's conduct is in no way matches that of a normal person. She is clearly spiritually deranged, and her presence in a place inhabited by so few people as we are represents a serious threat. This damning evidence came from the vegetarian with the steel dentures. In my article, the document appeared as categorical proof against the Baroness, though in fact, it was merely an assertion to be handled with care. So that's the beginning of the story.
Which goes on to have all sorts of intrigue, mayhem, rivalries, secret radio transmissions, and more. So as you mentioned, the stories all touch on Ecuador in some way, but they are set in Ecuador, in the Galapagos, in a mountain village in Ecuador, but featuring a Mexican wrestler and the former Miss Carabobo from Venezuela. One in the Amazon with US missionaries and their Gulf Coast hired gun. One in Brooklyn, one in Buenos Aires. Was there any common spark that kind of set off all these stories when you wrote this collection?
Well, there were lots of things, but the idea that all these places that you mentioned was something I had been thinking of what makes an Ecuadorian an Ecuadorian. Do you have to live in the country to be an Ecuadorian? Do you have to have a certain connection with it? Does your family have to have roots there? There's a very big Ecuadorian community in New York, for example. If you count the number of Ecuadorians living in New York that have migrated to the East Coast since the early 1950s, you could wind up with the second largest country in Ecuador. It's the inhabitants of New York make up more than a very large city in Ecuador. And there's all this connection with Latin American culture. Tango music was the music that my parents' generation listened to. So there's a strong connection also with Argentina. There's a very strong connection with Mexico through music, through film, through TV. So there was an idea that there's a larger community of Ecuadorians, that Ecuador is mostly a country that's not very well known. But if you look further down or enough into the horizon, you can see that it's always been there in the presence of what you can call Western culture. And the other thing was that all these stories that became short stories, fictional short stories, stemmed from work, journalistic work. So the Missionaries existed in the 1950s. The El Santo movie was shot in Ecuador in the 1970s. The Baroness Wagner de Bouquet lived in Floriana in the 1930s. There was a connection with the Second World War. The US had a base in one of the islands in the Galapagos, Baltra, as a way of defending the Panama Canal if the Second World War would have gone on longer and Japan would have been more involved, and they would have been able to pass through the Panama Canal to reach the US. So there's all these connections.
Thank you. Another thing I noticed is how many characters in these stories have double lives. There's a woman who discovers after her husband dies that her husband had a double life and a whole other family. There's the fact that El Santo, this character, this wrestler, historical wrestler, but who appeared in all these Mexican films, had all these doubles, and the story revolves around that. These characters in Summer Vacation, the story you just began, the Countess may or may not be a Countess. She presents herself as rich. She may or may not be rich. The vegetarian is actually a meat eater. There's a character in the story called Moving Day, Margareta, who's one person in Ecuador and a very different person in Puerto Rico. Do you have was something on your mind about double lives when you were working these?
Well, it's something that I think appears in most of the things I write. What you just mentioned is very visible in these stories, but there's also inside me in reflecting upon characters when I write them and when I try to make them three-dimensional, is that we all lead double lives. We're someone to the world and we're someone to ourselves. And sometimes those two don't match. And sometimes those not matching makes for high drama. So in these stories, I try to bring that into light in a sort of a fun way. Most of the stories are playing with humor, are playing with irony, are playing, are working under the tropes of certain genres, very recognizable, but they're not that also. So I was thinking of that idea of how much you know and how much you show and what's really behind the facade that we all have in daily life.
That was one of the things that made them fun to translate, was starting off, oh, I know what this story is going to be, and then no, actually, it's not. And each one had a different first-person narrator. All the stories are first person. They have different narrators, which also made it really interesting to translate, to get into the minds and languages of these narrators. You've got 2 journalists. I think the one in Summer Vacation struck me at different times as being either male or female, the one that whom we were just hearing from. You've got the woman who tells the story of meeting John Wayne Bobbitt, the famous Ecuadorian Lorena Bobbitt's former husband, the woman who finds the husband's other life, the male hired gun, the woman journalist in the El Santo one. What was it like inhabiting these different voices? Did you have fun? Which ones were a challenge?
One of the things I love about literature, not only the only thing, but one of the main things is being able to enter the minds of different people who are older, who are younger, who are different sex, who live in other countries, who inhabit different languages. And I also find it fascinating when I know someone who speaks 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 different languages, how their personality changes when they switch language, or seeing it in myself when my voice changes completely without me being conscious. Now that I look at it, I see it, but I would never be conscious of it, that it has a different pitch. It has a totally different tone. My body language is different in English and in Spanish. So when I try to write books, I try also to put certain challenges for myself as a writer. And when I was writing a family album, I was trying to, first of all, work in different genres, work with the tropes of different genres and break them. And the other thing was to inhabit the voices of different people. The story about the championship that Ecuador won the silver medal for Biddy basketball, was his basketball for children, is told through the voice of 2 people speaking in Brooklyn. And I found it very, very, I don't know what I would call it, but I found it very hard and fascinating to read your translation, because when I wrote it in Spanish, I was translating 2 people speaking in English into Spanish spoken by Spaniards, which is totally different from the Spanish spoken in different countries in Latin America. And I did that apropos because most of the translations we get in Latin America from North American writers are translated by Spanish translators. So it's the weirdest sensation to listen to an insult in English translated into Spanish from Spain. It has, you don't even feel that it's an insult because it's so distant. So I had fun doing that in Spanish. And then when I read the English translation, it just seemed foreign. It seemed like somebody else had written it because I had another accent and I had different sentences in my head when I was translating it into Spanish. Right. So that's one of the things that I find fascinating working with you, Dick, because there's always a back and forth. There's always reading what you've done and then trying to figure out what I tried to do and then editing through it between both of us. So that was one of the stories that really I found fascinating when I read the translation. All of your translations are great, but that one stood out because the initial voices in my head when I started the story were in English. The story that you mentioned about the missionaries in the Amazon jungle, there was a connection with New Orleans. I'm in New Orleans right now. I've been working in a lovely project with Tulane University, creating a digital archive of Latin American writers. I'm about to go back on Saturday to Ecuador. But I have this very strong connection with New Orleans, and New Orleans has a very strong connection with South America and with Spanish, because it was a Spanish colony, with French, with all this Creole culture that's a mixture. So I wanted to put someone from Louisiana in there, and the way that I found to do that was to have a person who works in oil rigs to go to Ecuador. So that voice and thinking of this person and who could he be and why he's trying to leave the US was also challenging. I had been reading at the time Lolita by Nabokov and rereading it actually. And I always found it fascinating that sometimes you're rooting for this horrible character who's the one narrating the story. And at some point I was trying to do that in that story, in my story in Family Album, to try to create someone that in some ways you can find some connection to, even though you know he's horrible. So it was one of the things that I tried to do to make it more challenging for me.
That story is really interesting because, first of all, it begins with him quoting someone else. So it begins with him quoting a geologist who is in turn quoting Humboldt, the 19th century German naturalist in South America. So we get a certain sardonic view of him because of his ability to imitate other people's voices. And then it switches to his. And yeah, he's very personable, but it's also continues to dawn on us what's likely to happen. And he provides distance on the other characters, on the missionaries. So that one was fascinating to me for the multiplicity of voices. Explain again, so in the one where the two guys are in the laundromat and the AA meeting and recounting the story of the Biddy basketball championship game between Ecuador and the United States, you put them in Peninsular Spanish because that's what that's what English, quote unquote, sounds like to South American readers, is it sounds like Peninsular.
Well, there's this incredible publishing house called Anagrama. And of course, there's translations in Argentina and Mexico that circulated from the 30s onwards. But Anagrama, for most of the late 20th century and early 21st century, has been the source of the best North American writers in Spanish. So, and it always struck me as very strange. So that's why I did it in Spanish.
It's very strange to me. You know, I translate a lot of Cuban writers, but Cuban writers are also translated by Brits. And when I read like Peter Bush's excellent translations of Leonardo Padura, but these Cubans are all speaking like Brits. And how is that possible? But, you know, in my translations, they're speaking like Americans. So it still is a strange thing. What about the role of journalists? You have a lot of journalists in your work. There's two journalist narrators here. There's Vargas, the journalist, who's one of the main characters in Postal Wells. I imagine this has something to do, again, with one of journalists' job is to uncover misrepresentations as well as representations. But what is it for you? Why do you like to get in the head of journalists?
Well, I've worked as a journalist, and I think one of the most dangerous professions in Latin America right now is the one that is the one that journalists take on. Yeah. Because they're dealing with stuff that even governments don't want to deal with at this moment. And it's sort of also, there's a reflection there of how journalists in some ways embody the figure of the detective, at least in my literature, because the figure of the detective, the profession of a detective, hasn't existed in Ecuador ever. Now maybe there's some that you can contact, but it's not a profession that's traditionally been there in South America. And journalists, in some ways, do what detectives do. You just mentioned it. They try to get behind the facade. They try to find what's been hidden. They try to find the connections, follow the money. They try to, and they also, another thing that's interesting with journalists and that I try to use when I write is that journalists inhabit liminal spaces. They don't necessarily move in the society that they might be a part of. They need to interview people. They need to go into dangerous situations. So they're sort of translators of what goes on behind closed doors or in places we don't want to see, or in places where cameras don't go, or in places where even the police doesn't go. And usually journalists are very stubborn until they get the story. And that's what I needed in these stories particularly. Someone who won't let go of the bone until they know what the truth, whatever that is, in the stories is. And in that way, in some way, comment on the situation that I'm presenting in the story, or the moment in Ecuadorian history, or what it says of the relationships between Ecuador and other countries, or the relationship between Ecuador and a more outside view of the world. And also journalists use words, like writers use words. So they're like the same building block, but out to do different things.
Yeah, when I think of that other story that features the journalist, which is the one about El Santo, the wrestler. So she finally goes to this small village in Ecuador in the mountains and tracks down a woman who had appeared in one of these films, and she's trying to get to the bottom of this mystery about El Santo. But then she runs into the mystery of this woman and El Santo and their relationship, and the abusiveness of that relationship, and why the woman stayed with him, or was it really him? And the journalist and that character, this is many years later, slowly develop a relationship, and the journalist is trying to understand. That was a fascinating and unexpected thing in that story. Was that there from the beginning? Did that appear suddenly as you said, how's she going to find this out? You remember, I know people ask us this and we make stuff up.
Yeah, I usually don't think of the story until I write it down. I have the characters, I have the beginning. I sometimes have the titles, but then the story sort of takes on a life of its own. This woman, Miss Carabobo, was actually in the real El Santo movie. And by the way, I just want to, for any El Santo fans out there, it's fiction. I'm not saying that El Santo had doubles all over the place and that there were doubles in all of his movies. I'm just speculating that it would have been a neat way of these movies having been produced in so many countries and in so quickly, because usually those movies, there were B movies that were made during the early 70s, late 70s, and they were done and they were shown almost after 3 weeks of shooting, and then very quick editing, and then they were shown mostly in Mexico, and then in the country where they had a specific actor from that country so that they could get new audiences. So this was a real plan that Mexican studios had at that time, because the peak of the Edad de Oro, the golden age of Mexican cinema, was in the 30s and the 40s and beginning of the 50s. And all of these stars, Dolores del Rio, Armendáriz, Maria Felix, all of them were starting to age, and they were, and also what the audiences wanted to see was also evolving and changing, and there was a new group of young people that wanted something that was different from what they had seen in this golden age of cinema. And this coincided with something that happened with wrestling in Mexico. You couldn't show it on TV. So the only way to see wrestling, which was a very popular sport in Mexico, was either to see it live or to see it in the movies. So all these El Santo movies started to be produced and shown all over South America and in Mexico. And as time went by, whatever new thing that this was started to lose its glitter. So they found this thing of looking for stars in Ecuador and in Colombia and in Guatemala and in Puerto Rico, and they would pair up El Santo with someone that was famous in that country. So that's what they did in Ecuador. They paired him up with Ernesto Alban, which was the main comedian in Ecuadorian theater at the time. So that's what I had in my mind. I wanted to play with this idea of the double, with the idea of the mask, of what masks represent, of what's behind the mask, and of this woman who decides to stay in Ecuador. And also with the idea that popular culture that I enjoy is also in some ways very tied in with a culture that's also very misogynistic. So I was trying to bring in this idea of violence against women with the idea of wrestling, and why would someone fall in love with someone that they can't even see? What's behind that makes a woman that's being maltreated or ill-treated to stay in a relationship? And then from there, it just went on and on and on.
Yeah, and it also brought up how the films themselves presented this fictional El Santo, who is el mano justiciero, a phrase we went back and forth a million times, the righteous hand of justice or something like that, which is different completely than the guy, and how that all gets fused. Well, I hope this conversation so far gives everyone in the audience a sense of the range of these stories and what you might encounter. Please, if you have questions, we'll go to Q&A in a few minutes, so you can click on the Q&A box in the bottom to ask your questions. While you're doing that, let me ask you, Gabriela, what have you worked on either since then, or what are you working on now? Because these stories were originally published 2012?
2010, actually.
2010.
They had a very winding road to be published. They were first published in Peru, then they were published in Colombia, and then they were published in Ecuador. And then some years later, they were published in Puerto Rico. And now they've been translated and published into English. I'm working on a big project right now. Because I'm in New Orleans, I've been so lucky to be able to go to a beautiful archive that there is in the city called the Historic New Orleans Collection. And there was an Ecuadorian painter, curator, and gallerist from Guayaquil, Ecuador, that lived in New Orleans. He arrived in the mid-60s, and then in the 70s, he started to exhibit in the city. And then in the 80s, he had a very well-known gallery. He was part of creating one of the most important art movements in Louisiana in the 20th century, the Visionary Imaginists. So I'm writing a novel about him, but I'm also, right now, I've been invited to become part of La Academia de la Lengua Ecuatoriana, which is sort of the Letters Academy. I don't know how you would translate that into English.
We don't have one.
Okay. Well, it's something that all of the countries in Latin America have, and there's one in Spain also. And I've been writing about him and his use of language and puns and his polyphonic abilities by knowing English and Spanish, and using humor as a way of appropriating certain symbols and questioning certain truths that are accepted usually in the art world. So it's been lots of fun. It's been lots of time in the archive. It's been lots of reading about art in the 20th century. It's been interviewing people that knew him. Unfortunately, he died in 1996. But before dying, he left all of his paintings, his sculptures, and the material that he had written, cassettes. He kept all of his the stubs of his
checks,
airplane tickets. So you can follow the route he followed since he left Ecuador in 1964 until a few months before he died, when he loved tennis and he went to the US Open in New York. So you can follow that route. You can also follow the route of his family, which is also fascinating coming from him, because he was very provocateur. He was very much a trickster figure. And one of his family members is one of the saints of Ecuador, El Santo Hermano Miguel. He was also connected to one of the presidents of Ecuador from the late 20th century. He was also connected to one of the independence heroes from Spain in the 19th century. So it's been very interesting. It's been I have all these folders. I have tons of material. And now the idea is to put all of this together. It's also very complicated because at some point he decided to stop speaking in Spanish. And I'm going to write the novel in Spanish, but he spoke in English. And all these cassettes he left are in English. And all the articles that were written about him are in English. And all the puns are in English. So I'm trying to figure out how that's going to work. So I've been doing a lot of work on that book.
Sounds like it will be fun for us. Let's see what we've got in the Q&A. Anonymous says, I heard mention of Marquez in the intro, and I'm definitely hearing a kinship in your writing. Are you influenced or inspired in any way by Garcia Marquez and or other writers?
Well, what you heard in the intro, and thanks for the question, was that during some years, the main library of Colombia had this incredible literary prize that was intended for more books of short stories to be published, because Garcia Marquez was such a great writer of short stories. So they had this $100,000 prize for the best short story book collection of that year. And I was one of the finalists. But I love Garcia Marquez. I don't think particularly that he's an influence on my work. But other writers, I mean, there's tons of writers that I love. But in this book, you just mentioned a while back Humboldt. I was trying to look at people who had written about nature in the 19th century, or who had some connection to Ecuador. So when I was writing Album de Familia, or family album, I was rereading Humboldt and his travels from Venezuela down to Peru and his long stay in Ecuador. He climbed the Chimborazo, and some of his ideas about evolution came from that. About ecological systems came from his observations of finding flora and fauna in Chimborazo that was very similar to the flora and fauna from the mountains in Europe, in Germany specifically. I reread Darwin, and one of the main influences in that story, particularly because I'm writing from the point of view of this man who's coming from Louisiana into the jungle, and the jungle becomes this, the representation of hell in some ways. I reread The Heart of Darkness by Conrad, because the people who live in the jungle in no way see the jungle as something to fear or as something that is stalking them. But when you're coming from the outside and having no knowledge of how life in the jungle works, then of course it becomes a omnivorous presence. So I could keep on citing authors, but Garcia Marquez was someone I read completely. When I was a teenager, I read all of his books, And I've read all of his books until the books that he published when he was alive.
Someone ask the two of us, can we speak about our collaboration? At what stage or stages, for example, do you read/edit each other? How do you settle differences? I think that they're referring to you and me here. Well, I send a lot of questions. In most writers' writing, especially in Gabriela's, I think there's a lot of interesting and unusual uses of words, often differently than the way that they're often used. Plus, there's a lot of Ecuador, specifically Ecuadorian references or references to the particular country. So I'll send a lot of questions, and then I'll send a draft, and then we'll have a lot of backs and forths with, in the comment boxes. I'll ask, did you mean this or did you mean this? Does this do it or does that do it? Or Gabriela will say, whose English ear is so excellent, will say, clunky, clunky, clunky in English. And I'll say, yeah, but I did it because. And she'll say, what about this? And then I'll say, that almost works. And what about this? So it's very much, since Gabriela is also a translator, like working in a translator's workshop, where we kind of go back and forth and brainstorm. What else do you have to say about this?
Mostly that it's joyful to work with you. What I've seen over time, because we met, but we didn't meet. You were in the audience when Pozo Wells came out in Cuba. And then we started emailing. And at first I was very reticent to make any comment. And now that we know each other and that we're friends, I sometimes say more clunky than I should sometimes. But knowing that you'll take it well and that we'll be doing it back and forth, and it's only for the text to sound better.
So it is, yeah. The questioner asked about collaboration, and it's been a very collaborative, very back and forth process, which I certainly am always learning from. Someone says, I'm fascinated by authors who can write truly captivating short stories. How do you decide whether a piece is best delivered succinctly and when it's worth cultivating and expanding?
While I'm writing it, I figure it out. So sometimes this happened to me once. I was trying to write about something that Dick has also translated from another book, which is a fascinating story about a radionovela. How do you say that in English?
Soap opera, more or less, but not quite.
Like a soap opera that was written for the radio of the War of the Worlds by an Ecuadorian man that worked in the radio. And this actually occurred in 1949, who hadn't heard of what Orson Welles had done already in 1938 in New York. So I didn't only want to write about that. I wanted to write about what was going on in the late 40s in Ecuador, what was going on in the city was growing out of the main downtown historical center. And it was a 300-page novel that at some point I stopped and started to edit and didn't see that it was working. So I just put it away in a drawer and said, well, I tried, doesn't work. And then there was a Colombian publisher who wanted to start his publishing house with a book by myself. And he asked me, do you have anything? And I said, well, no, not at the moment. And then I remembered this novel and I said, well, let me see. So I took this novel and then I started editing, and it became a long short story. So that was a very clunky process of turning a novel into a short story instead of the other way around. But mostly it's when I have more characters, when I need to expand the idea of what is being said and seen and what isn't, when I need for there to be more, or when the story is more complicated, and that I can't do it all in 8 pages or 10 pages, because the stories in Family Album are very short. They're not more than 10 or 12 pages, the longest one. And sometimes I just feel that the story needs more air, more space to develop. I need to bring in other things to make it stronger. But mostly I just set out to writing something, and then by midway I realized if it's gonna turn into a short story or it's gonna turn into a novel.
Thank you. Are you inspired by visual art in any way? I can hear how much you're thinking of nature and the environment.
Very much so. Even when I was writing this collection, I was thinking that I didn't want to write stories that were set in cities. I wanted to write about the countryside, of how one perceives it and how it's represented, how it depends on the point of view. If it's something that that is something that works with the people work with the environment, or the environment is against the people, or the perception of it. And also because something that's there in Pozo Wells that I wrote in 2007, it's this looming threat of what's coming, because I mean, we have it very present in Ecuador, because in the late 1960s, oil was started to be exploited in Ecuador, and Texaco came in, and later Chevron, and all these oil spills have contaminated the Amazon, and there's not much more petroleum or oil in Ecuador, but they've discovered tons of oil, gold and copper, and what's coming isn't good. And I keep on thinking ways of trying to avoid this, and sometimes that seeps into what I'm writing. The last story in Family Album mentions these mines that were discovered in the 1980s in Ecuador, and the horrible ecological problems that arose from them. They're only touched very light, just the surface of it. It's mentioned. It's not. It was going to be the main part of the story, but while I was writing it, I realized I didn't want to go there, but rather to talk about another problem that Ecuador faces, which is mulas. If you go to women penitentiaries in Ecuador, more than 80% of the women that are in jail in Ecuador have something to do with micro trafficking of drugs. These women have been caught trying to smuggle mostly cocaine out of the country, and because of the very harsh laws, they wound up for 10, 15, 20 years in jail. So that's the turn it took, and I didn't go to the mines. But the idea of ecology is very present all the time.
It's striking to me how in Ecuador, when you wrote the new constitution, it has both a section that gives rights to the environment and a section that encourages extractive industry. So it's like, here's a question. Gabriela, are there English language writers who have influenced your work? And either of us, are there English language writers who could be compared to Gabriela as a writer? Wow.
Well, I have tons of writers I love. One of the main ones that I always reread, I have her books next to my bed usually, are Grace Paley's books. She's a very unusual short story writer, essayist. When I discovered her, it just opened something in my brain, and I kept on looking for more of her books. She is incredible, incredible. And then Barry Gifford is one of my literary heroes, and he writes one of the blurbs for Family Album. So the day that I got that blurb that City Lights sent it to me, I was jumping in my house. I had to open a bottle of wine and salud because it was incredible. And then there's, I mean, one of my favorite writers from when I was a teenager is Mark Twain. I love Angela Carter from England. I love Paul Thoreau, who had a connection with Ecuador because there was this great North American writer who lived in Ecuador, Maurice Thompson, who I highly recommend to anyone who doesn't know Maurice Thompson's books. He went in the mid-1960s to Ecuador and stayed to live there and wrote some of the most incredible books that break any notion of genres. He wrote memoir, he wrote autobiography, he wrote essays. So yeah, there's tons of writers that I love in English.
In terms of an English language writer who could be compared, it would have to be someone with a lot of variation, in what they do, because each book of Gabriela's that I read is different from the other. The novel that follows, Prose Wells, is very different, very literary in its language and fine-grained, and also she mixes in her genre stuff in that one, Gothic with historical. So someone with a lot of range, but I don't know why I'm thinking about this exactly, but City Lights published a while ago a book of stories by Ry Cooder, the musician and music producer, about LA, which also use kernels of the past and mix genres in these funny ways. That book, in some way, reminds me. Yeah, I forget what it's called, but City Lights published it, and it's this collection of LA stories by Ry Cooder. Let's see, do we have time for one more maybe? Here's a comment. Alexander von Humboldt wrote about his adventures and findings in Ecuador, among other places in South America. See Andrea Wolf or Wolf's The Invention of Nature. Question, do you have a favorite story in Family Album? Mine changes. I think right now my favorite one is the El Santo one, which is called what? Costume Party.
Yeah, I don't know. I had lots of fun because it was very challenging to write the story of the Baroness, the one that I read right now. But I also love the story that opens up the book, that's also set in the Galapagos. Mostly because it reminds me of the time I spent in the Galapagos. I was lucky enough to teach there. And because I was there for a large amount of time, I learned to scuba dive, and that's also in the story. And I also got to go into the archives that they have in one of the centers there in San Cristobal. And then just being able to swim with sea lions and iguanas is incredible.
Here's one fun question. You mentioned the narrator in your reading was, quote, a dentist and a vegetarian. Do you have a favorite vegetarian dish?
It has to be something with eggplant. Eggplant is incredible. I love eggplants.
There we go.
And I just had one the other day here in New Orleans. They're very inventive with food, even though they're not very vegetarian. But it was there were these discs of eggplant. They were simmered in something because the taste was very inside the vegetable, and then they were fried, deep fried, and they were incredible.
Thank you. Ellen Cassidy tells us that the name of the Ry Cooder book is Los Angeles Stories, City Lights Noir Series 2011.
Oh, thanks.
And I appreciate your discussing the nuance and difference between different Spanish-speaking nationalities and all of the complexity and cultural variation therein. Are there any writers or activists you enjoy who also speak on this awareness? While Gabriela is thinking about that, one of the most fun and interesting collaboration parts to translate in Prose Wells is a conversation between an Ecuadorian and a Mexican. It's even more complicated than that, but it plays with their different uses of the language, and they're commenting on how each other does it.
Mary Ellen Faithweber. I have a publishing house in Ecuador with a brother and a friend. And we're just, next week, we're going to have the book launching. It's a book that I edited for the past 5-6 years. And it's essays, articles, chronicles of people who aren't from Ecuador, who stayed to live in Ecuador, and who arrived from the mid-60s until 2010. And Mary Ellen lives in the cloud forest in Intag. And she started a community newspaper, and she's an incredible writer. And she has one of the funniest and most nuanced and great articles in that book. It's about her experience in the 1980s going to a place in a cloud forest where there was supposed to be a paradise. And what she really encounters on the way to that paradise. It's incredible. And the book is called Granite and Rainbow, Travels in 20th and 21st Century Ecuador. It's probably going to be in ebook format probably next month. It's going to be difficult to sell the book in the US, but it's probably going to be in some form in ebook.
In English or Spanish?
We did it in English and in Spanish.
Cool.
So
and Mary Ellen is also the translator of two of the stories in yes. Family Album. Last question, I think. How do you come to Spanish after presumably having been brought up in Portuguese?
Well, I wasn't. I was born in Brazil, but my family's from Ecuador. So I've been brought up in Ecuadorian Spanish. And Southern Pacific Colombian Spanish, because my grandmother was from Tumaco.
And New York English?
Yeah,
for a year in elementary school, right?
I did second, third, and fourth grade in New York in PS 175.
Okay, I think that does it for the questions. Jess, are you going to come back on? Hi.
Yep. So thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Dick and Gabriela, for speaking with us again. Before we go, I do actually have one last question that we like to end our programs with. What are you currently reading, or what would you like to suggest?
I just bought a book by Bell Hooks on art. So I'm reading that. There are essays on art, and it's great.
I just read a book that I picked up while I was out running by an author named Peter Gansort, published by Milkweed Press in 2010, called Extra Indians, which is among many other things about Indians who are extras in Hollywood movies. I love that book, Extra Indians.
All right, well, thank you both again, and thanks to our audience. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. Please support Gabriela and PNP by using the link in the chat to purchase Family Album. Check our website for the most current updated event listings. We are offering some in person in our stores now as well, but those are all listed on the website. We do hope to see you all there, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you once again, Gabriela and Dick. Stay well read, everyone, and we'll see you next time.